Thank you so much. I want to thank the Faculty of Theological Studies at the University of Bucharest for inviting us, and in particular Professor Danka and the RVP, to whom I'm indebted for many things. Bismihi tabaraka wa ta'ala, in his name, exalted and blessed. This is a very difficult and painful subject to talk about, not only as a Muslim, but in terms of religious conflict and misunderstanding. It is something that is rarely discussed or understood in Europe or America, and even more rarely discussed by Muslims, which is a serious shortcoming. But it is the most damaging and long-lasting division in the global Islamic community, the schism between the Sunni and the Shia branches of Islam. And over the past 4 or 5 decades, it greatly intensified in bloodshed and was entangled with global and regional geopolitical agendas. This 1,400-year schism over the succession to the Prophet Muhammad, who died in June 632 of the Common Era, led to the formation of these two primary sectarian identities, the majoritarian Sunni and the minority Shia, who comprise about 13% of the global Islamic community, and themselves are split up among various sectarian trends or identities. The Shia are not a monolithic entity, neither are the Sunni, of course. The historical tensions between the Sunni and the Shia arose in the early period, even perhaps immediately following the death of the Prophet Muhammad, and were aggravated under the first dynasty, the Umayyad rulers who ruled in Syria, and then crystallized under the Abbasid caliphs in the 8th century, who ruled from Baghdad, and was aggravated even further after many centuries in the 16th century with the forcible conversion of the Iranian lands to Shiism from majoritarian Sunni identity with the rise of the Safavid dynasty. So Iran has historically been mainly a Sunni sphere of influence, but only in the last 500 years has it become a center of Shiite identity. You have to keep that in mind. So the Iranian Revolution in 1979 marked a watershed in the reassertion of Muslim identity worldwide, Sunni and Shia. And the recent events in the previous century, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Lebanon, the Gulf, Arabia, have coalesced along regional lines and confessional fault lines, marking an intensified renewal of this ancient schism. The chief obstacle against mutual understanding remains the burden of crystallized attitudes inherited from the past. Both the Shia and the Sunni have used and have abused the past. At the level of popular religious attitudes and observances, this painful schism continues to operate with its own inevitably fatal logic. Even today, people are being killed for being a Shiite or a Sunni. Deep psychic and emotional wounds arising from their disagreements were cemented in place centuries ago by continuing polemic and misunderstanding, which fester unresolved in the heart of the Muslim mind. What is needed to heal this ancient schism and to facilitate the concerted oneness, unity of Muslims worldwide who belong to different legal, ideological, theological, and doctrinal orientations? Recently, in March 2023, China brokered an agreement between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the staunch upholder of Sunni identity in the Arab world, and the Islamic Republic of Iran, who has spearheaded the Shiite revival in the Middle East, to exchange embassies and resume trade relations after more than several decades of animosity and cutting off of relations. And this hailed a possible resolution of the civil wars in Yemen, a brutal and ugly conflict, and in Syria, and even perhaps reconciliation within Iraq, which is barely a majority Shiite state and has had very intense sectarian rivalries and bloodshed, as well as parts of the Arabian Peninsula itself. Eastern Arabia of Saudi Arabia is a majority Shiite area in that area. By the way, that's the site of most of the oil in Arabia. It's inhabited by the Shiite. On May 7th, just last month, the Arab League reinstated Syria as a member. And just last week, Bashar al-Assad went to Arabia and was admitted and gave a speech to the Arab League, hailing his, so to speak, rehabilitation in the majority Arab political league. And this should signal also the shift regarding Iran, because the Ba'athist regime in Syria and his group, his identity of Bashar al-Assad's family, comes from a minority Shiite sect within Syria called the Nusayri, who are extremist Shia, who have some heretical doctrines even from the point of view of the mainstream Shia, right? And had been allied with Iran in the last few decades, since the start of the unraveling of the Syrian polity with the rise of a popular uprising. So this marks a dramatic shift in the geopolitical identities and alliances in the Arab world and between the Arab countries and Iran, and with the main international actors active in that region, primarily Russia and China, since American influence has receded dramatically in the last few decades. These peace dividends, anticipated possible peace dividends, from the rapprochement between the Republic, Iran, and the Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, involve possible responses by the United States and Israel, who are interested parties in this, as well as by Turkey, who have troops in northern Syria and interests in Iraq, where there's a Kurdish outhold, a strong Kurdish resistance, and along the yet unresolved nuclear negotiations between America and Iran. So today we will try to briefly deal with three main topics. We will review the recent strategic and political reality of the Middle East, or Southwest Asia, and the exploitation of this ancient schism by internal and external actors. Then we will move to briefly portray the contrasting the Sunni and Shia worldviews, their foundational myths and self-definition, motivating their communal large group identity. Finally, we will offer some basic suggestions for pursuing realistic strategies for unity among Muslims that might possibly help repair the past and open a path to a more humane and dignified future through accommodation and reciprocal toleration. Now, the first area of concern is the post-colonial realignments in the aftermath of the Shia-Iranian Revolution of 1979, in conjunction with the rise of Sunni jihadist terror. Repeated United States-led interventions into the heart of Asia over the past several decades. Desert Storm, 1991, that's in Kuwait and southern Iraq. Afghanistan, 2001 until 2021, against the Taliban and Qaeda. Iraq, 2003 until 2011, etc. Also fueled intra-Muslim violence and bloodshed. This has not been emphasized enough. For example, in Iraq, when the Americans intervened and replaced the Sunni Ba'athist regime of Saddam Hussein with a Shiite-led regime in Baghdad, this led to a major reshuffling of political actors inside the country. Recall that they disbanded the official Iraqi army, and there was a host of neighborhood militias and armed people who appeared, and violent bloodshed between the Sunni and the Shia communities proliferated. Some of it was in fact intentionally goaded on and incited by the United States, and this has been documented. There's a very interesting BBC documentary on the role that the United States played in arming and facilitating Shiite revenge gangs against Sunni outposts in Baghdad and other cities. And this was their way partly to deal with the Sunni resistance to the American occupation of Iraq, which was led by Sunni jihadists. So since that time, over the past 4 decades, especially with the end of the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 89, when the Ba'athist regime attacked Iran, this is one of the most bloody and vicious wars that occurred since World War I. Southwest Asia was shaken by a continuous series of proxy conflicts spearheaded by the Kingdom of Arabia against the Islamic Republic of Iran. Actors in the region were promoted, incited, armed, and funded by these two entities, the Sunni Saudi Kingdom and the Shiite Islamic Republic of Iran, to have conflict and violence, and this, in a way, was a reborn antagonism from the century-old dispute and schism that had split apart the Muslims over 1,400 years ago, and has led to devolution and the state unraveling in the Southwest Asian area. The sectarian turmoil at times was unparalleled in its intensity and violence. And we saw, in fact, one particularly ugly eruption, the Islamic State, so-called Daesh, Dawlat al-Islamiyya fil Iraq wa Sham, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, from 2014 on, which has been more or less contained, but even just a few weeks ago, the Turks announced that they had killed the current leader of the Islamic State in Syria. By the way, they're always killing the current leader. Another one will pop up. And this has also had repercussions and echoes across many Muslim societies in Africa and in Asia and Central Asia. Internecine bloodshed in Pakistan, where there are weekly killings of Shiite, especially intelligentsia, doctors, educators, lawyers, wealthy businessmen, by fundamentalist radicals of a Sunni persuasion. Nigeria, Indonesia, it's quite a long list of conflict, of misunderstanding, of isolated incidents, and sometimes of tremendous outrages. This event, 1979, the Iranian Revolution, was a profound watershed in the reassertion of Islamic identity worldwide. And it reawakened the antagonism between the long marginalized Shiite communities of the Arab world in South Asia. The leading Arab monarchies, mostly headed by Sunni royal families or princely families, and the Muslim majority nations of Pakistan and others. Iran, being a mosaic, 90% or more are Ja'fari-Shi, the 12 are Shiite persuasion, the largest Shiite group. Persian and Azeri Turkish, ethnically different, but still Shiite. And yet they have a minority Kurdish population, a Turkoman population, a Baluchi population, those are mainly Sunni. And this led to the emergence of Iran as a regional power, confronting the United States hegemony and vying for regional influence, and actively promoting Shiite interests and Shiite causes in states such as Kuwait, Bahrain, Lebanon, Iraq, and other areas. So the rising power and vitality of the Shiite communities in West Asia is a very sensitive issue for Sunni Arab elites and prompted competition for regional influence. Fueled by the petro-wealth of the Gulf monarchies from the 1970s onward, The puritanical Wahhabi ideology of Sunni traditionalism was exported globally. You find this across many Islamic societies in Asia and Southeast Asia and North Africa, where schools, mosques, civic societies are funded from Arabia, and they are part of this Arabian network, a very conservative, puritanical form of Islam, the Wahhabi sect. It has transformed the discourse and mindset of many regional Muslim cultures, the influence of Saudi Arabia worldwide in this respect, the reassertion of a strident, Sunni, aggressive mentality in face of the appearance of a strong center of Shiite power in Iran and its related satellite areas. It has transformed the discourse of these areas, and the older traditions of tolerance, of diversity, the open acceptance of pluralism has hardened into an exclusivist, conformist outlook intolerant of diversity. This was not typical historically of many Muslim societies. Indonesia is a famous case. But the conflict between the kingdom and the republic has led to this hardening of attitudes and of speech. And it remains a feature of radical Sunni ideology in countries ranging from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Libya, Nigeria, etc. Autocratic Arab regimes now seek increased armaments and novel strategic alliances to defuse populist domestic pressures for social and political reform. I can't give you all the details of this painful history, but what we are seeing in a sense, especially what has been taking place in the allies of the Iranian Shiite regime, Iraq, Iran, Lebanon, who are all Shiite majority countries, marks the birth pangs of a radically altered Southwest Asia, where the Shiite bloc has now emerged as a major player. Of course, this is not countenanced with ease by countries like the United States, nor by the kingdom itself. These conflicts revolve around the question of whether broader visions of identity will succeed and usher in models of political and economic power sharing and nation building, promoting genuine positive development. Or if the post-colonial rentier state model, coupled with the abuse of ethnic, religious, and doctrinal bias, is enabled to ensure continued division and stagnation. So there's a lot at stake. Ultimately, the question must be faced where the Muslims today have the intelligence, the courage, and creative commitment to heal the aching wound that sundered the community when God's messenger Muhammad died. This feature of identity politics, the flattening down of Islamic self-awareness into a narrow ethno-cultural group identity, is a notable feature of the region today. Whether Arab, Turk, Malay, Persian, etc. It can be called regressive large group mentality, where the individual understanding and assertion of oneself is flattened and fitted into a large group, lower common denominator. You find this in many nations, of course. The very presence and the doctrines of a rival divergent group then becomes viewed as an existential threat, challenging the authority and legitimacy of one's own group. This perceived threat by the Muslim other may then easily be exploited by unscrupulous leaders to promote short-sighted political and religious alliances. Hatred and antagonism ignite base passions, fanned into flames and manipulated for securing local or community solidarity and support, etc. You see this very well in the rise of new leaders and new power actors in countries like Iraq and in Syria with the dissolution of the old state structure. So it's a free-for-all to see who can grab the power and exercise even a local or neighborhood authority or a larger regional authority and help themselves to the wealth of that region. The religious and the political mingle and feed upon each other with factional and clique interests and geopolitical confrontations fanning the flames. So I can't go into detail with the effects of the United States intervention, multiple interventions which have been devastating and negative and have helped ensure the antagonisms have continued until now. These fault lines that have grown and have been solidified continued to amplify and deepen this vicious sectarian milieu. For a period in the 1990s and early 2000s, there was an almost rampant, uncontrollable surge of sectarian bloodshed in countries like Iraq and Syria and in parts of North Africa as well. And it has led to the continued penetration of strategic outside actors to manipulate these situations. Russia is a notable example. It has played a major role in Syria and even is now occupying and having military presence in Syria on behalf of the Assad regime, the Ba'athist regime. And the United States has also solidified its military aid and poured munitions into Sunni monarchies and polities. They have established, for example, a very important air base in Qatar called Al Udeid, the Combined Air Operations Center, with advanced technical facilities to monitor and integrate troop activities throughout the Middle East and Afghanistan. There are other aspects of the United States arming of countries and penetration of their state actors. And Western sanctions against Tehran and now against Moscow have begun to tighten the cooperation between Russia and Iran and Syria, and have led to a new power alignment in Southwest Asia, where Russia is playing an increased role along with China and India in forming a bloc to counter a Western presence and Western influence. This is a very important development which will have consequences for the next decade or two, long, middle term at least, and will take into account these older sectarian antagonisms and be exploited for the benefit of one or another regional actor as well as its global partners. Now, a section of my paper dealt with historical polarity and antagonism between the two major branches of Muslims. But unfortunately, I'm going to have to basically cut it out because of the time. And I had analyzed it in depth, and I had written about this and published on it. It's a very important aspect. And the main point about reviewing it, because it's a painful history, is to show that Muslims themselves have not faced up squarely to their own history and to the contradictions involved in their own self-identities and self-definitions, their own mythic narrative about their origin and the unfolding of their polity and their faith. And they have become, in a sense, crystallized in the conviction of the myth or the historical narrative that they tell themselves is what really happened. And for someone to come and explain to them that it's slightly different from what they imagine or accept, they're very, very sensitive to that and would react very negatively to it, okay? I had, for example, given an analysis of two historical novels that appeared in the 8th century, that's the 2nd century of Islam, in southern Iraq, in the major metropolis of Kufa. And these novels are very indicative of the kind of myths that were elaborated and woven around the debate and the split between Muslims. And I'm going to briefly present them in an overview to give you some glimpse into the depth of the passions and hatreds that were generated over 1,200 years ago and still shape attitudes today. There was a pro-Sunni, anti-Shiite historical novel by an author called Sayyid ibn Umar, who died in the year 180 of the Hijrah, that's 796. Scapegoating the evil machinations of a half-Jewish, half-black convert to Islam and a Shiite heretic whose name was supposedly Abdullah ibn Saba, and whitewashing the corruption and nepotism of the third successor to the Prophet Muhammad, Uthman, who was killed in an uprising by Sunni, proto-Sunni Muslims who rebelled against his corruption and his nepotism and tried to revert back to a more prophetic model of rule. And this fiction shows that the supposed mythic cooperation and unity of the companions of the Prophet, whom it was inconceivable that they could ever disagree, and they were obviously united together and had the same vision and understanding of Islam, when in fact the historical reality is opposite, that they strongly disagreed and had sharp divisions among themselves. This is all put down to the evil machinations of this half-Jewish son of a black whore, which is the worst thing you could possibly be, I suppose. And therefore that this man infiltrated into Islam, pretended to be a Muslim, and connived to make the companions at opposition with each other, led to their fighting each other, led to two major civil wars during the caliphate of the fourth successor, Ali ibn Abi Talib, and led to the deaths of tens of thousands of Muslims. The Prophet died in the year 11 of the Hijrah, and by the year 36, less than 40 years, less than 30 years, the Muslim community was at arms against each other and fighting vicious sectarian civil wars over who would be the leader. The Sunni majority won out, so that the leadership of Ali was rejected, and the Shiite became a minority, persecuted and oppressed. And the name of Ali, the cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet, married to the Prophet's daughter Fatima, and father of the Prophet's two grandsons, Hassan and Hussein, was publicly cursed from the pulpits for 80 years. Cursed. You prayed by cursing Ali. That was the religion of the time. Anyway, these are the kind of disputes and dissensions that led to this. So according to this fictional novel, which by the way, we only knew from references in later historical works until a manuscript that was discovered in Saudi Arabia about 30 years ago in tattered fragments and edited in a facsimile edition by a very good scholar, an Iraqi, and it shows that it was a complete whitewash and it was a fictional history of the early period. That vision has penetrated into the standard Sunni historical account of the early period. Right? Everything they say about those divisions was all lies, nothing happened, they loved each other. And then this outside guy who was a Jew who wanted to destroy Islam from inside, he came in and he connived to make them hate each other and fight each other. So it's a conspiracy theory, very powerful conspiratorial attitude. Most of the standard Sunni historical accounts of early Islam bought this story and repeat parts of it. Okay. The other typical example is a highly polemical writing ascribed to a so-called companion of Ali, a man called Sulaym ibn Qais, also produced in Kufa around the same time, middle of the 2nd century, which alleges to portray the secret inner history of the early Muslim community and the divisions with their companions in the utmost scandalous way about the people who allegedly sabotaged Islam from within. Who were they? The leading Sunni companions, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, the leading senior companions around the Prophet who were hypocrites and who really didn't believe the Prophet at all, but went along with him for their own personal power grab, and who in fact maliciously maligned and defamed and attacked Ali and the Prophet's family afterwards, because it was a fact that no one could deny that Ali was combated and fought and defeated by a majority of the Muslims, and that Ali's two sons were killed, one in battle and another by poison, so that the Prophet's family ended up being dispossessed and defeated and rejected by the majority of the community. These are the kind of facts historical facts that Muslims don't want to hear. And in fact, the official Sunni position on the issue of the companions and their identity and their support of the Prophet's mission is the official position, good Muslim. They call it as-sukut amma shajara bainahum, silence about what broke out between them. A good Muslim should not ask. A good Muslim should not question. A good Muslim doesn't need to talk about what happened. Because if you do, then your faith is suspect, and you're obviously not a good Muslim. So that's the situation. This should give you some glimpse into the kind of division and depth of hatred of these two communities historically. Now, if I come to the last few minutes of my presentation, I've left out so many important points. We are facing an uncertain future. The fact that there has now been a political rapprochement brokered by China and assisted by Russia, not by the United States. This is an important point. The United States is no longer an actor in Southwest Asia. It's no longer a force to reckon with. Even its alliance with the oil-rich states of the Kingdom of Arabia and the Gulf monarchies has been more or less marginalized. The Saudis are now talking to the Russians. They are not observing the boycott against Moscow. They are cooperating with this new Shanghai Cooperation Council, in which China and India and Iran are major players in, as well as the newly independent states of Central Asia. And so this marks a significant geopolitical shift away from the older post-World War II configuration of powers when America and Saudi Arabia were close allies, right? And so this raises the question, even if there is some kind of political or economic rapprochement between Shiite Iran and Sunni Saudi Arabia, what will this do to the older underlying animosities and hatreds and myths that still motivate people? Will they be able to translate this political and economic deal into some kind of cultural and religious accommodation? And this is not clear at all. The older underlying hatreds are certainly alive and well. The religious leadership of Saudi Arabia, Wahhabi clerics, are fanatic about the Shia. They will go along with the Mohammed bin Salman, the prince heir apparent, in his attempt to refashion the foreign policy of his nation. But whether they themselves are convinced that Shiites are worthy of being sitting next to them at the table is another question. So there are other issues here, but I just want to mention 2 or 3 points that I think might be relevant. The foremost avenue to halting the abuse of the past through zealous assertions of the absolute rightness of one's own particular doctrinal group is the critical historical rethinking of the past by leading individuals positioned to reshape the minds and hearts of their communities. Insights promoting more realistic and less judgmental understanding may be sought by properly comprehending how this schism came about historically. This involves education. This involves, for example, at the primary school level, official documents to be generated that are more objective and more tolerant and balanced, so that from an early age, students have some idea of the complexity of the situation and not to repeat the old assertions and myths and fanatical misunderstandings. Simplistic groupthink that recycles dogmatic convictions expressed in what they call takfir, labeling someone a heretic or an unbeliever, has to be transformed by an appreciation for nuanced complexity and a willingness to take responsibility for past errors. This involves a critical examination of the hadith narratives, the transmitted narratives of the past, which are playing such an important role in Muslim consciousness, and also understanding the very mission and role of the Prophet Muhammad himself. May God whelm him in glory and give him peace. In fact, there has been some model of reconciliation along these lines, intellectual level, in the past by leading thinkers, and this needs to be revisited and amplified today. Also, the importance of symbolic acts and gestures addressing deeply ingrained attitudes and assumptions is fundamentally important. This type of effort demands creative leadership with the courage and sincerity to risk engaging together with opposing blocks or communities. It's not possible to overcome some of these animosities and misunderstandings, but practical, pragmatic efforts to cooperate, for example, let's clean up the neighborhood by collecting the garbage. Let's have some internal security against theft and crime together. Whether we're Shiite or Sunni, we both want a secure neighborhood, right? This kind of basic, fundamental, common sense cooperation would encourage better understanding of different communities rather than blind killing at checkpoints. They must address these urgent human needs and common interests for health, security, for economic equity, for good governance, and for fair elections, etc. So we're involving individuals in the local communities in common efforts that benefit all could help overcome this type of animosity and misunderstanding. Plus, we should exploit the treasures in the Islamic tradition of profound ethical, intellectual, and spiritual heritage, which has been overlooked for far too long. The overemphasis on legalisms, on the Sharia-conscious hair-splitting, on outer conformity to legal requirements has to be supplemented and amplified by ethical and spiritual considerations which emphasize the deeper well springs of the Islamic identity and faith, and give people hope that it's possible to live a different kind of communal existence. And this dispassionate search for harmony and mutual understanding may eventually help displace the bitter assertions and hostile accusations, fueling suspicion, distrust, and hatred, and splash cold water over the malicious sparks intended to fuel a conflagration through such means. The wise man from the north said once, "The present moment exists to repair the past and to prepare the future. If Muslims today do not make sincere creative efforts to stop abusing their past, they will be condemned to suffer the same in the future." Thank you very much.